Wealth attraction research. War. Cold calculation. Wealth attraction research. WAR. War. Cold calculation. You're listening to Wealth Attraction Research. War. Cold calculation. Presented by Hakeem Alivokas Alexander on Wisdom, Social Audio Inc., and Spreaker, Social Podcasting, presented for World Reading Club in association with ExercisingYourMind.com and UniquilibriuM. This edition's reading focus comes to us from, at the very least, The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, 1776, The Little Book of Economics, published in 2020, and How Money Works, published in 2017. The two second and third books are compilations of information from various different researchers and contributors. Right away, I'm starting off with The Wealth of Nations simply because I find it to be a little bit more interesting and more in-depth, as well as more concise than the other books, except for some of the other ones I have from Robert Kiyosaki, which I might get into some of that later. But his exposition is much more clear, even though it is, even though the language might seem to be at first more complex. It's actually the foundation for a lot of this work that comes afterwards. It's incredible how much of the other works that I'm reading in modern economics are based off of his. So it's good to see this foundation and how influential his work actually is. So this is chapter 6 from The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, and previously I read chapter 5 of Wealth of Nations, which was about money. The chapter 4 started off with the which was called Of the Origin and Use of Money. Chapter 5 was of the real and nominal price of commodities, of their price in labor and their price in money. And now chapter 6, we are here at what is called Of the Component Parts of the Price of Commodities. Adam Smith. In that early and rude state of society which precedes both the accumulation of stock and the appropriation of land, the proportion between the quantities of labor necessary for acquiring different objects seems to be the only circumstance which can afford any rule for exchanging them for one another. The proportion between the quantities of labor necessary for acquiring different objects seems to be the only circumstance which can afford any rule for exchanging them one for another. If among a nation of hunters, for example, it usually costs twice the labor to kill a beaver which it does to kill a deer, one beaver should naturally exchange for or be worth 2 deer. It is natural that what is usually the produce of 2 days or 2 hours' labor should be worth double of what is usually the produce of 1 day's or 1 hour's labor. If the one species of labor should be more severe than the other, some allowance will naturally be made for this superior hardship, and the produce of 1 hour's labor in the one way may frequently exchange for that of 2 hours' labor in the other. Or, if the one species of labor requires an uncommon degree of dexterity and ingenuity, the esteem which men have for such talents will naturally give a value to their produce superior to what would be due to the time employed about it. This is very important. I mean, this is a very simple thing. Hello, Cecilia. This is a very simple thing here, and it's very interesting. So this is the idea of value and how it is based on labor, first of all, and as it should be. But then it's also based on the agreements between people. So the very simple example is, right, if it usually costs twice the labor to kill a beaver, which it does to kill a deer, one beaver should naturally exchange for or be worth 2 deer. Right? But then he goes on to say, if the species of labor should be more severe than the other, some allowance will naturally be made for this superior hardship, and the produce of 1 hour's labor in the one way may frequently exchange for that of 2 hours' labor in the other. So, for example, if there's an extremely intense labor that goes into 1 hour of work, right, but then 2 hours of work, that intensity is spread out. This is a good example. We can look at this mathematically, but in the most simple of mathematical ways, right? We can say it like this. In 1 hour, the intensity is rated at 100, right? For the whole hour, the intensity is at 100%. Whereas if the intensity of the labor over 2 hours that 100% is spread over those 2 hours, so that in each hour it's only 50%, right? Or 50 points. You can call it points, percent, whatever you want to. But that the intensity of each hour is half that of what was put into the labor of another thing, right? Then that would say that 2 hours labor at 50 points each hour can be exchanged equally for that 1 hour that's at 100 points. You see that at the intensity level. So that's what that part there means. All right, so, continuing, or if the one species of labor requires an uncommon degree of dexterity and ingenuity, right, the esteem which men have for such talents will naturally give a value to their produce superior to what would be due to the time employed about it. So the dexterity and ingenuity, right, itself may be one thing, but the thing that's more important is the esteem which people give for such talents will naturally give a value to their produce superior to what would be due to the time employed about it. So the value will increase based on what how people regard it, the esteem they have about it. So again, these are all things about value and money in labor, right? So one value is given to things because of the esteem, how people feel about it. Just in the same way in previously where the understanding of value was given, right? There's exchange value and there's use value. Where at least now, because we're not in like a Mad Max situation, right? But at least now water has a lot of use, right? But it use value. Everybody needs water, but it has very little exchange value. You can hardly exchange water for a car or anything else, right? But it has a high use value. But in the other way, for exchange value, it has very little. Whereas a diamond has very little use value, or at least it did back in the time of Adam Smith, because they weren't making drill bits with diamonds and stuff like that, right? But it has very little use value, but it has a high exchange value. So you can exchange diamonds for a whole lot of shit. You can exchange diamonds for cars, clothes, a lot of stuff, because people find value in diamonds, even though the use of it is very little. But like I said, even in the time of Adam Smith, that may have been so, as well as a lot of metals because of the technology differences. I mean, now silver, for example, has a higher use value than it did in a lot of times, because silver wasn't really the best for a lot of things, except now it's used in a lot of electrical components, as well as palladium and gold and things like that. Whereas before, they were simply money or had nominal value, where their use value wasn't as high. So this is an agreement, right? The esteem which men have for such talents will naturally give a value to their produce superior to what would be due to the time employed about it. Continuing, such talents can seldom be acquired, but in consequence of long application, and the superior value of their produce may frequently be no more than a reasonable compensation for the time and labor which must be spent in acquiring them. I'm sure a lot of people, you've heard stories of someone saying something like, go. So let's say there's a contractor, right, who wants to hire a contractee, or an employer wanting to hire an employee for, let's say, a temporary employment, right? And so the employer says to the employee, the potential employee or contractor or contractee says, the contractee says to the, give me a moment, breath, the contractee or contractor or employer says to the employee or contractee, how much is this going to cost and how long will it take? And so the person doing the work says, it's going to cost $1,000 and it will take me 10 minutes. And so the employer or the contractor says, 10 minutes, then why am I paying you $1,000? And the person says, well, because it took me 10, 20, 30 years to get to the point where I could do this thing in 1 hour or 10 minutes, right? And so that's what this means here, right? Such talents can seldom be acquired, but in consequence of long application. And the superior value of their produce may frequently be no more than a reasonable compensation for the time and labor which must be spent in acquiring them. That's interesting. And the superior value of their produce may frequently be no more than a reasonable compensation for the time and labor which must be spent in acquiring them. That's interesting. Because he's saying, this is even different from what I just said, right? Because what I said was that such talents can seldom be acquired, but in consequence of long application, right? And that's why sometimes it costs so much. But he's saying, and the superior value of their produce may frequently be no more, right, than a reasonable compensation for the time and labor which must be spent in acquiring them. Well, actually, no. Reading that more, yes. So there may be no more than a reasonable compensation for the time and labor which must be spent in acquiring them. Okay. So he said such talents can seldom be acquired, but in consequence of long application, and the superior value of their produce may frequently be no more. Oh, right. So he's saying it may frequently be no more, meaning they're not adding anything to it, but it's really no more than a reasonable compensation for the time and labor which must be spent in acquiring them. Okay, so that consequence of long application, yeah, that's okay. So it is exactly what I said. Then it's a reasonable compensation for that 10, 20, 30 years, which was the time and labor which was spent in acquiring those skills, those talents, right? Those superior talents which make that superior produce. All right, good. I'm on point with this. Okay, here we go. Continuing. In the advanced state of society, allowances of this kind for superior hardship and superior skill are commonly made in the wages of labor. Okay, so these are the allowances. So he's saying they're being paid in accordance. And something of the same kind must probably have taken place in its earliest and rudest period. In this state of things, the whole produce of labor belongs to the laborer, and the quantity of labor commonly employed in acquiring or producing any commodity is the only circumstance which can regulate the quantity of labor which it ought commonly to purchase, command, or exchange for. As soon as stock has accumulated in the hands of particular persons, some of them will naturally employ it in setting to work industrious people, whom they will supply with materials and subsistence in order to make a profit by the sale of their work or by what their labor adds to the value of the materials. Right, so here's the person who has the stuff. They have the machinery, they have the raw materials, and they're employing industrious people, these same industrious people who gain superior skills through as the consequence of long application, right? Which were those things that were regarded because they have an uncommon degree of dexterity and ingenuity, right, which was acquired in consequence of long application, right? These are those industrious people they're talking about here. And so so we have as soon as the stock we're referring to, let's call those materials and machines, right, the things that are needed to make these things, right, have been accumulated in the hands of particular persons. Some of them will naturally employ it in setting to work industrious people whom they will supply with materials and subsistence in order to make a profit by the sale of their work or by what their labor adds to the value of the materials. In the simplest way you can think about this, what their labor will add to the value of materials. So you can have a certain piece of granite, which in itself has a certain value. But the industrious person, let's say a sculptor, they can sculpt that into a fine statue or even a piece of equipment, right? They can turn that thing, that piece of granite into something else, or a hunk of iron, which may be worth something all on its own, but then they can fashion that iron into a hammer, a head, or like or a screwdriver or something, right? They can turn it into something different, or a gear. And so that's what happens when when their labor adds value to the materials, the material being iron or granite or whatever, and their labor sculpts it or forms it into something else. So in exchange, this is that alchemy about turning base materials, because it's not only about metals, base materials into gold. In exchanging the complete manufacture, either for money, for labor, or for other goods, over and above what may be sufficient to pay the price of the materials and the wages of the workers, something must be given for the profits of the undertaker of the work who hazards his stock in this adventure, right? Hazards their stock really means risk their materials, right? Because remember, the stocks are the materials or the raw supplies, the machinery, even the lab, the shop, or the warehouse where this is being done. They're hazarding their stock in this adventure. The value which the workmen add to the materials, therefore, resolves itself in this case into two parts, of which the one pays their wages, the other the profits of their employer upon the whole stock of the materials and wages which he advanced. He could have no interest to employ them unless he expected from the sale of their work something more than what was sufficient to replace his stock to him, right? Makes sense, right? Like, you wouldn't just buy a bunch of materials for $100 and then give them to somebody to work on them and expect only to get $100 back, right? No, like, you expect to get 1,000 back, because you pay the $100 for this materials, this iron, this wood, this shop, or whatever it is, right? And then you also have to pay for the labor, the skill, these industrious people who, through the consequence of long application, have a high or uncommon degree of dexterity and ingenuity, right? So you have to pay them for that, which, remember, they're being paid no more than a reasonable compensation for the time and labor which must be spent in acquiring that uncommon degree of dexterity and ingenuity, right? These industrious people. So so the person who owns the stock, right, which is basically, again, the machinery, the raw materials, the warehousing, the lab, the shop where the stuff is being made, he pays that $100, then he gives it to them to work on it. Their labor has to be paid for, and then, of course, he has to make a profit on top of that. So again, it says, he could have no interest to employ them unless he expected from the sale of their work something more than what was sufficient to replace his stock to him. And he could have no interest to employ a great stock rather than a small one unless his profits were to bear some proportion to the extent of his stock. The profits of stock, it may perhaps be thought, are only a different name for the wages of a particular sort of labor, the labor of inspection and direction. They are, however, altogether different, are regulated by quite different principles, and bear no proportion to the quantity, the hardship, or the ingenuity of the supposed labor of inspection and direction. They are regulated altogether by the value of the stock employed, and are greater or smaller in proportion to the extent of this stock. Let us suppose, for example, that in some particular place where the uncommon annual, let us suppose, for example, that in some particular place where the common annual profits of manufacturing stock are 10%, there are two different manufacturers, in each of which 20 workmen are employed at the rate of £15 a year, or at the expense of $300 a year in each manufactory, right? So you have 20 times £15 a year, right? That's the expense of $300 a year in each manufactory. By the way, manufactory, that's the old word where we get the word factory from. It just comes from short from manufactory, right? So let us suppose, too, that the coarse materials annually wrought up in the one cost only £700, while finer materials in the other cost 7,000. The capital annually employed in the one will in this case amount only to 1,000 pounds, whereas that employed in the other will amount to 7,300 pounds. At the rate of 10%, therefore, the undertaker of the one will expect an yearly profit of about 100 pounds only, while that of the other will expect about 730 pounds. But though their profits are so very different, their labor of inspection and direction may be either altogether or very nearly the same. In many great works, almost the whole labor of this kind is committed to some principal clerk. His wages properly express the value of this labor of inspection and direction, though in settling them in some regard is commonly, though in settling them some regard is had commonly, not only to his labor and skill, but to the trust which is reposed in him, yet they never bear any regular proportion to the capital of which he oversees the management. And the owner of this capital, though he is thus discharged of almost all labor, still expects that his profits should bear a regular proportion to his capital. Guys, this is the explanation of the old owner-CEO, and the differences in why the owner, CEO, the tops and heads of companies get paid so much more and even expect to get paid so much more than the people who work for them. You see, when people are complaining about how much they get paid, this is the exact reason why right here. This is where it all comes from. This book from 1776 explains so much. It's interesting that the book was published in 1776 by a Scotsman, Adam Smith, right? Which was the same year that the United States was formed, right? 1776, Declaration of Independence, all that good stuff, right? 3 years after the Boston Tea Party, when they revolted about the taxes on tea. All about money, right? All about, which comes down to labor. This is all about power and control over labor. You got to understand this is where it's coming from, and it's not altogether from such a maleficent. Did I just say the name of Maleficent? It's not even coming from a dark, evil place. It might seem like that to people who don't understand the division of labor. But listen again, right? So for one, we're talking about, industrious people would be the laborers, right, who have an uncommon degree of dexterity and ingenuity, right? And this means you have a lot of skill. You're really good at what you do. And those talents can seldom be acquired but in consequence of long application, right? Meaning years of study and application and doing it, right? And the things that they produce are held in high esteem by people who have esteem for such talents, right? And it naturally gives a value to what's produced superior to what would be due to the time employed about making it, right? So usually, like for example, the example that was given before, right, that if it costs twice the labor to kill a beaver which it does to kill a deer, right, then one beaver should naturally exchange for or be worth 2 deer. So if it costs twice the labor, right, meaning it's twice as hard to kill a beaver than it is to kill a deer, then of course one beaver will fetch you 2 deer, right? Or vice versa. If it's twice as hard to kill a deer than it is to beaver, then, or if you don't like those examples about killing animals, because they're talking about hunting and labor and things like that. Like if it's more difficult to make an arrow than it is to make a knife, right? Or even then, of course, like if it takes twice the labor to make an arrow than it does to take a knife, then of course one arrow will fetch you 2 knives. Or even better yet, because this is even a better example, if I'm going to use the bow and arrow example, right? If it costs twice the labor to make a bow than it does an arrow, then one bow will fetch you 2 arrows. So the bow maker could exchange one bow for 2 arrows, and then he has, of course, his own bow, and he's got 2 arrows now to fire from it. Where now the arrow maker has a bunch of arrows, now has his bow. But going back, right? But all of that, though, is who provides the materials, right? Because this is how this has happened. And of course, I'm not saying that this whole system wasn't hijacked, right? But listen to this, right? But this is the thing about how the wages get so mixed up and confused, and why people see it as such a different thing. All right, so there's a person, right, who oversees this thing, and this is what they call inspection and direction, right? Because this is what happens to be. It's like the person who oversees what's going on. So it may perhaps be thought the profits of stock, right, are only a different name for the wages of a particular sort of labor, the labor of inspection and direction. They are, however, altogether different, are regulated by quite different principles, and bear no proportion to the quantity, the hardship, or the ingenuity of the supposed labor of inspection and direction. This is what the owners and CEAs do. They inspect and direct, right? So they are so the way that they are different, they are however altogether different, are regulated by quite different principles, and bear no proportion to the quantity, the hardship, or the ingenuity of the supposed labor of inspection and direction. They are regulated altogether by the value of the stock employed, and are greater or smaller in proportion to the extent of this stock. Remember, the stock is the materials, the stuff being used. Even the shop or lab or warehouse where this is being done. Let us suppose, for example, that in some particular place where the common annual profits of manufacturing stock are 10%, there are 2 different manufacturers, in each of which 20 workmen are employed at the rate of £15. Now, manufacturers, remember, are also known as factories. So when you hear the word manufacturers, it's a factory. So that in some particular place where the common annual profits of manufacturing stock are 10%, there are 2 different manufacturers, in each of which 20 workmen are employed at the rate of £15 a year, or at the expense of $300 a year in each manufactory. Remember, the word manufactory is the predecessor to factory. They just took off the manu. So that's where a factory, right? Factory workers, they would call them before manufactory workers. Let us suppose, too, that the coarse materials annually wrought up in the one cost only £700, right? So you have both of these places. They run at an expense of £15 times 20 workmen, right, which is £300 a year. But the coarse materials in one place only cost £700. So then one place, that's 300 plus 700 is 1,000, right? While finer materials in the other cost 7,000. Right, so that's 7,300, right? So the capital annually employed in the one will, in this case, amount to only £1,000, right? Whereas that employed in the other will amount to £7,300. At the rate of 10%, therefore, the undertaker of the one will expect an yearly profit of about £100 only, right? So 10%, that's his profit. He's making profit off of what he spends, right, at a percentage. So at 1,000 times 10%, you get 100. So he's only expecting £100 only, while that of the other, right, who spends more, right, which is 7,300, will expect about £730, because that's 10% of 7,300. But though their profits are so very different, their labor of inspection and direction may be either altogether or very nearly the same. Right? So the managing of this, the inspection and direction, right? The labor that they put into that, these bosses, these managers, right? Their labor of inspection and direction may be either altogether or very nearly the same. But it's the stock, the materials that were spent, that they expect to get a 10% return on. Not that exactly the labor anymore. This is what's happening, what's been changing, right? In many great works, almost the whole labor of this kind is committed to some principal clerk, right? So they're saying in many great works, and all this stuff that's done, in all this manufacturing, almost the whole labor of this kind is committed to some principal clerk, CEO, managing director, so on and so forth, the boss. His wages properly express the value of this labor of inspection and direction, though in settling them some regard is had commonly not only to his labor and skill, but to the trust which is reposed in him. Yet they never bear any regular proportion to the capital of which he oversees the management. And the owner of this capital, though he is thus discharged of almost all labor, right? The people at the top, he's discharged of all labor. They ain't doing shit, right? That's what people complain about. He ain't doing nothing. White collar, right? Although he is discharged of almost all labor, still expects that his profits should bear a regular proportion to his capital. That's that 10%, right? He still expects, no matter what. That's the thing. If I'm responsible for either 1,000 pounds a year or 7,300 pounds a year, whichever it is, I expect to get 10% in return for it, even though I'm not doing that work, right? That's interesting, though. I try to say it's not exactly. That's not the percentage of my cleaning business, but that's hilarious. I'm reading this now. Interesting. Though in settling them in some regard is had commonly, not only to his labor and skill, but to the trust which is reposed in him, yet they never bear any regular proportion to the capital of which he oversees the management. And the owner of this capital, though he is thus discharged of almost all labor, still expects that his profits should bear a regular proportion to his capital. In the price of commodities, therefore, the profits of stock constitute a component part altogether different from the wages of labor, and regulated by quite different principles. In this state of things, the whole produce of labor does not always belong to the laborer. He must in most cases share it with the owner of the stock which employs him. Right? This is what's happening, because what this is saying here is that unless you're supplying all of the materials and everything yourself to make something, then you have to share, right? The produce of that labor, of the owner that employs that to you. Like even in a more indirect way, like if, for example, like I earn money from doing these talks and then putting them on my podcast, right? So if I'm doing that, but I'm using a software to do that, right? Spreaker, right? And I pay for my subscription to their service, right? They own that stock, that they own the platform. I'm merely using their stock, right? Which this is digital in this case, but in other cases of like publishing a book, it'd be different. Or like, let's go back to the ironworks, right? Like somebody would supply me with a block of iron and I make something out of it, an axe or an arrowhead or whatever, right? I have to share the produce of that and the profits that come from it with the owner of the stock, the one who supplied it to me. Like Spreaker supplies to me their platform, so I pay them to be able to use it because I'm earning money from it, right? So in this state of things, the whole produce of labor does not always belong to the laborer. It doesn't always belong to the laborer. He must, in most cases, share it with the owner of the stock which employs him, even though I'm not employed by them, right? But it's a similar idea. I'm using something to make something, and someone is supplying that. Neither is the quantity of labor commonly employed in acquiring or producing any commodity the only circumstance which can regulate the quantity which it ought commonly to purchase, command, or exchange for. An additional quantity, it is evident, must be due for the profits of the stock which advanced the wages and furnished the materials of that labor. As soon as the land of any country has all become private property, the landlords, like all other men, love to reap where they never sowed, and demand a rent even for its natural produce. Ha 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 ha. Here we have. Listen to this. The truth is being told. Do you hear the truth being told here? Do you hear what is happening? Listen to this. As soon As the land of any country has all become private property, the landlords, like all other men, love to reap where they never sowed, and demand a rent even for its natural produce. The wood of the forest, the grass of the field, and all the natural fruits of the earth, which, when land was in common, cost the laborer only the trouble of gathering them, come even to him to have an additional price fixed upon them. He must now then pay for the license to gather them, and must give up to the landlord a portion of what his labor either collects or produces. This portion, or what comes to the same thing, the price of this portion constitutes the rent of the land, and in the price of the greater part of the commodities makes a third component part. Y'all, do you hear what has just happened? Right? This is the thing that we oft miss when it comes to this. We oft miss this piece of the puzzle, where it's because the land has become private. This is the secret part here, y'all. This is what is happening. This is what the problem is. This is where the extra costs come into everything, right? I gotta read it again. You gotta listen to it. As soon as the land of any country has all become private property, the landlords, like all other men, love to reap where they never sowed, and demand a rent even for its natural produce. That is, the wood of the forest, the grass of the field, and all the natural fruits of the earth, which, when land was in common, right, when it wasn't private, cost the laborer only the trouble of gathering them, come even to him to have an additional price fixed upon them. He must then pay for the license to gather them, and must give up to the landlord a portion of what his labor either collects or produces. This portion, or what comes to the same thing, the price of this portion constitutes the rent of the land, and in the price of the greater part of commodities makes a third component part. Why do you think the Kiowas in the Amazon all committed mass suicide? Because of the government of Brazil taking away their land and their beliefs. The real value of all the different component parts of price, it must be observed, is measured by the quantity of labor which they can, each of them, purchase or command. Labor measures the value not only of that part of price which resolves itself into labor, but of that which resolves itself into rent, and of that which resolves itself into profit. You want to know why things get marked up? Why things cost so much? Because it's rent and profit is being added to what the labor would normally be by itself, right? Farmer's market, you're paying these people who go there and they pick and gather things all on their own, right? Lower prices. I don't know about nowadays. I haven't been to a farmer's market in a while, right? But then you go to the supermarket, maybe it's different price, maybe it costs more, or maybe the quality is lower, right? But now, look at that. Labor measures the value not only of that part of price which resolves itself into labor, but that which resolves itself into rent, and of that which resolves itself into profit. In every society, the price of every commodity finally resolves itself into some one or other, or all of those three parts, right? Labor, rent, profit. And in every improved society, all the three enter more or less as component parts into the price of the far greater part of commodities. In the price of corn, for example, one part pays the rent of the landlord, another pays the wages or maintenance of the laborers and laboring cattle employed in producing it, and the third part pays the profit of the farmer. These three parts seem either immediately or ultimately to make up the whole price of corn. A fourth part, it may perhaps be thought, is necessary for replacing the stock of the farmer or for compensating the wear and tear of his laboring cattle. and other instruments of husbandry. But it must be considered that the price of any instrument of husbandry, such as a laboring horse, is itself made up of the same three parts: the rent of the land upon which he is reared, the labor of tending and rearing him, and the profits of the farmer who advances both the rent of his land, of this land, and the wages of this labor. Though the price of corn, therefore, may pay the price as well as the maintenance of the horse, the whole price still resolves itself either immediately or ultimately into the same three parts of rent, labor, and profit. In the price of flour or meal, we must add to the price of the corn the profits of the miller and the wages of his servants. In the price of bread, and the profits of the baker, and the wages of his servants, and in the price of both, the labor of transporting the corn from the house of the farmer to that of the miller, and from that of the miller to that of the baker, together with the profits of those who advance the wages of that labor. This is all where all of this comes from, right? People would complain about why things cost so much. Well, that's why. You're not paying just for, or you think it's just somebody sitting there making a pair of fucking shoes? No, those shoes have to be, where do the materials from the shoes come from, first of all? Why do you think so many of these people are sending their labor overseas to different countries where their labor is so cheap, right? Because where does it get resolved to? It must be considered that the price of any instrument of husbandry, such as laboring a horse, is itself made up of the same three parts: the rent of the land upon which he is reared, the labor of tending and rearing him, and the profits of the farmer who advances both the rent of his land and the wages of his labor. What does he mean by he advances both the rent of his land and the wages of his labor? Meaning he lets it be used first before he gets paid for it. Right? In the price of flour or meal, we must add to the price of the corn, right, the profits of the miller who mills the corn and the wages of his servants. In the price of the bread, the profits of the baker and the wages of his servants. And in the price of both, the labor of transporting the corn from the house of the farmer to that of the miller, and from that of the miller to that of the baker, together with the profits of those who advance the wages of that labor. The price of flax resolves itself into the same three parts as that of corn. In the price of linen, we must add to this price the wages of the flax dresser, of the spinner, of the weaver, of the bleacher, and together with the profits of their respective employers. As any particular commodity comes to be more manufactured, that part of the price which resolves itself into wages and profit comes to be greater in proportion to that which resolves itself into rent. In the progress of the manufacture, not only the number of profits increase, but every subsequent profit is greater than the foregoing, because the capital from which it is derived must always be greater. The capital which employs the weavers, for example, must be greater than that which employs the spinners, because it not only replaces that capital with its profits, but pays besides the wages of the weavers, and the profits must always bear some proportion to the capital. Here's the thing. Here's a hacking secret, right? Why then do you think so many people, why do you think when Ray Kroc was asked about what business he's in, and everybody laughed and said, of course you're in the business of selling hamburgers. He said, no, I'm in the business of real estate. Well, I was just talking to Andrea Raquel, right, about cults and shit. What's the business of the Church of Scientology? It ain't religion. They own billions and billions of dollars of real estate. So do a lot of other places. Have you guys seen all of those empty Boston markets? Right? Why do you think the buildings are still sitting there with all the furniture and tables inside of them? They've been closed a long time ago, and they're just still sitting there with all the stuff there because they own the real estate. Something else is going to be done with that. But remember, right? Back what I just read. As soon as the land of any country has all become private property, the landlords, like all other men, love to reap where they never sowed, and demand even a rent for its natural produce. They demand even a rent for its natural produce. How do you take the power back? Own the land. Own the real estate, the royal estate. That's how you take it back. You want to move from being a peasant to a prince, from a pauper to a queen, right? From a proletariat to an empress or an emperor. Want to move from living in the slave house to an empire? Take the land back. As any particular commodity comes to be more manufactured, that part of the price which resolves itself into wages and profit comes to be greater in proportion to that which resolves itself into rent. We all renting. In the progress of the manufacture, not only the number of profits increase, but every subsequent profit is greater than the foregoing, because the capital from which it is derived must always be greater. The capital which employs the weavers, for example, must be greater than that which employs the spinners, because it not only replaces that capital with its profits, but it pays besides the wages of the weavers, and the profits must always bear some proportion to the capital. In the most improved societies, however, there are always a few commodities of which the price resolves itself into two parts only, the wages of labor and the profits of stock, and still a smaller number in which it consists altogether in the wages of labor, right? So sometimes it's not all of the rent, labor, and stock being the raw materials and things like that, right? In the price of sea fish, for example, one part pays the labor of the fisherman, and the other the profits of the capital employed in the fishery. Rent very seldom makes any part of it, though it does sometimes, as I shall show hereafter. I like the way this language uses the word shew, S-H-E-W, as I shall shew hereafter. It is otherwise, at least through the great part of Europe, in river fisheries. A salmon fishery pays a rent, and rent, though it cannot well be called the rent of land, makes a part of the price of a salmon as well as wages and profit. In some parts of Scotland, a few poor people make a trade of gathering along the seashore those little variegated stones, commonly known by the name of Scotch pebbles. The price which is paid to them by the stone cutter is altogether the wages of their labor. Neither rent nor profit make any part of it. You see, and this is where you and I and other people can come in, right? Gathering stones, for example. We will get paid very little because we're not being paid for the rent. We just went to the seashore and gathered a bunch of fucking rocks, right? And then sold it to the stone cutter, right? And what does the stone cutter have? Why are they so special, right? Well, because they have an uncommon degree of dexterity and ingenuity, right? The esteem which men have for such talents will naturally give a value to their produce superior to what would be due to the time employed about it. Such talents can seldom be acquired but in consequence of long application, and the superior value of their produce may frequently be no more than a reasonable compensation for the time and labor which must be spent in acquiring those talents, right? Through the consequence of long application. Right, so those stone cutters, right? But the price which is paid to those poor people that he says, right? In some parts of Scotland, a few poor people make a trade of gathering along the seashore those little variegated stones commonly known by the name of Scotch pebbles. The price which is paid to them by the stone cutter is altogether the wages of their labor. Neither rent nor profit make any part of it. Right? So that's it. They're just going out and gathering stones and then selling them. How many of us can do that? How many of us can gather stones? People talk about, you want to know about some physical alchemy? How you can get money from kind of nothing except for your labor? See, that's the real magic. Magic is labor. The alchemy. Cut through to that. Get something done. Do something that needs to be done on your own, and you can get paid for it. And it's not called profit, right? It's just a price paid for your labor. Altogether, the wages of their labor, neither rent nor profit make any part of it, right? Because you're not charging the stone cutter for rent because you're not renting the beach where you went to go pick up those stones. You don't live there, right? Your house is not there. And you're also not paying any profit, right? Because you're not having to make profit because it wasn't you're not making a profit off. I mean, kind of in a way, you're making a profit because it seems like nothing except for your time, right, and labor. That you can call that your profit, but it's not profit in the way that businesses otherwise make a profit. Continuing, but the whole price of any commodity must still finally resolve itself into some one or other, or all of those three parts, as whatever part of it remains after paying the rent of the land and the price of the whole labor employed in raising, manufacturing, and bringing it to market must necessarily be profit to somebody. As the price or exchangeable value of every particular commodity taken separately resolves itself into some one or other or all of these three parts, so that of all the commodities which compose the whole annual produce of the labor of every country, taken complexly, must resolve itself into the same three parts, and be parceled out among different inhabitants of the country, either as the wages of their labor, the profits of their stock, or the rent of their land. The whole of what is annually either collected or produced by the labor of every society, or what comes to the same thing, the whole price of it, is in this manner originally distributed among some of its different members. Wages, profit, and rent are the three original sources of all revenue as well as of all exchangeable value. Once again, wages, profit, and rent are the three original sources of all revenue as well as of all exchangeable value. All other revenue is ultimately derived from some one or other of these. Whoever derives his revenue from a fund which is his own must draw it either from his labor, from his stock, or from his land. Remember, stock here means the raw materials, again, stuff that you have that can be made into something else, or even a building where people can use to make something else, or equipment like a computer or whatever to make something with. So whoever derives his revenue from a fund which is his own must draw it either from his labor, from his stock, or from his land. The revenue derived from labor is called wages. That derived from stock by the person who manages or employs it is called profit. This is why Jim Rohn says in his Building Your Network Marketing Business, he says, profits are better than wages. That just occurred to me looking at here. I did actually listen to that back in 2003, and I knew what he meant, that because wages are what you work at a job, what you get, like your income, whereas wages are profits. Whereas profits are the income you get from owning stock, which is saying, or the materials or something that people rent from you or use in order to make something else. Profits are better than wages. So he says. A lot of people won't think that's fair. A lot of people will scoff at that. I don't want to be a landlord or owner of something or exploit people like this. But that's how you take the power back. Whoever derives his revenue from a fund which is his own must draw it either from his labor, right, from his stock, or from his land. The revenue derived from labor is called wages. That derived from stock by the person who manages or employs it is called profit. That derived from it by the person who does not employ it himself but lends it to another is called the interest or the use of money. Oh, profits. We have wages, profit, and interest. Or the use of his money. Oh, we're getting into the deep. Yo, by the way, again, all of this from 1776, this is still how it's happening today. I'm just realizing after looking at so many things later on, when I first started back in 1997 with Rich Dad Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki, and then the next year I got the books when they first came out because just so happened I graduated from high school in 1996. I was spending a lot of times in the bookstore. As a matter of fact, I worked in Borders bookstore, and I was 20 years old when I worked there because I had gotten into all these books and I wanted to be close to them all the time and get discounts. And I had found all these books and started reading Rich Dad Poor Dad, and all that other stuff I'm seeing is all this is doing is coming right back to this, to the wealth of nations. All of it now is becoming so much more clear by coming to the source. Like all that other stuff, they're all derivatives. It's all watered down. This is the source. Continuing. right? That derived from it by the person who does not employ himself but lends it to another is called the interest or the use of money, right? That goes back to what I was reading before, right? Where it says that and the owner of this capital, though he is thus discharged of almost all labor, still expects that his profits should bear a regular proportion to his capital, right? He's discharged from all the labor, not doing it. That's the CEO, the person, the white collar, right? Not doing anything that you so you say, except for supplying the stock, right? Or the money. And that profit, that money derived, or the revenue, we'll call it, that's the better word for it, the revenue derived from it by the person who does not employ it himself but lends it to another is called the interest or the use of money. It is the compensation which the borrower pays to the lender for the profit which he has an opportunity of making by the use of money. It is the compensation which the borrower pays to the lender for the profit which he has an opportunity of making by the use of the money. Right? What do you get a loan for? Right? You get a loan, and why do you pay interest on it? You pay interest on it, right? You pay, as the borrower, you pay to the lender for the profit which you have an opportunity of making by the use of the money. Right? It's not a guarantee. You have an opportunity of making by the use of the money. The profit which you have an opportunity of making by the use of the money. That's what the interest is for, because you don't have it yourself. So you're borrowing for you. That's why you borrow money for business. A lot of people borrow money for business and don't understand this simple concept right here. Why are we paying interest? Right? You're paying interest, right, for the profit which you have an opportunity of making by the use of that money. Right? Why are you paying rent to an office, to use an office? Right? Because of the profit that you have an opportunity of making by the use of that office. In that case, rent is sort of like the interest being paid, right? Because they already have the office. Why are you paying it? Remember, I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying that's what it is, because look, as soon as the land of any country has all become private property, the landlords, like all other men, love to reap where they never sowed and demand a rent even for its natural produce. Right? You put a fence around something, now you're a landlord, and you can charge for the fucking oranges on that orange tree, even though that's its natural produce. The orange trees were already there. Now you put a fence around it, and people can't walk by anymore and pick up those oranges off the ground. They have to pay you for it. They learned that a long time ago, and decided to crop up farms and put fences around here and there. Right? It's not right or wrong. It's what it is. But understanding it puts you in a position. Go pick up some rocks at the beach and sell it to the stonecutter. If you need looking for a way to start. Start picking rocks instead of kicking rocks. Don't be dead, use your head. Part of that profit naturally belongs to the borrower who runs the risk and takes the trouble of employing it, and part to the lender, who affords him the opportunity of making this profit. The interest of money is always a derivative revenue, which, if it is not paid from the profit which is made by the use of money, must be paid from some other source of revenue, unless perhaps the borrower is a spendthrift who contracts a second debt in order to pay the interest of the first. That's what people do, right? Getting out another credit card to pay off the fucking interest of another. I've never, by the way, y'all, I don't use regular credit cards at all, and I built my credit up by using credit cards which basically operate like debit cards. I can't spend any more that's on it, yet it still gets reported every single month as if I'm paying my balance off on time. That's another little secret hack that a lot of people aren't using and don't understand, right? That there are credit cards set up that you can use. One of them's Chime, right, for example, which people would look at and be like, oh, Chime, that's not a real this and that. You have no fucking idea what they're doing. You don't understand the system. You don't know how to use it. You can't spend any more than you have unless you start borrowing into like their real credit thing that they have, which I don't suggest that you do, right? Because then you get sucked into it. There's a way they'll suck you into it. They're not stupid. They can actually open a small line of credit to you, where you get like a an overdraft protection of $40. But then if you didn't have that $40 in the first place, now you have to pay it back from the next time you get money put on that card. That's, it's all a trick. It's called cash flow management. If you do it right, you can make magic happen. But there's always black holes or white holes or some kind of fucking hole, right, that you can fall in. That's what gravity, right, is related to the word grave, right, pulling you down. But that's only one pole of gravity. There's gravity wells, like a well goes into the ground, down, pulls you in, like a grave into the ground, and there are gravity hills. If you study anything about electrogravitics or what's known as anti-gravity propulsion or things like that. But let me not digress too much. So again, the interest of money is always a derivative revenue, which, if it is not paid from the profit which is made by the use of the money, right? Like, so if you borrow money and you don't make a profit from using it, right, then it must be paid from some other source of revenue, right? What other source of revenue? Unless, perhaps, the borrower is a spendthrift who contracts a second debt in order to pay the interest of the first. The revenue which proceeds altogether from land is called rent and belongs to the landlord. The revenue of the farmer is derived partly from his labor and partly from his stock. To him, land is only the instrument which enables him to earn the wages of his labor and to make the profits of his stock. All taxes and all the revenue which is founded upon them, all salaries, pensions, and annuities of every kind are ultimately derived from some one or other of those three original sources of revenue, right, which are labor, stock, and rent, right, and are paid either immediately or mediately from the wages of labor, the profits of stock, or the rent of land. When those three different sorts of revenue belong to different persons, they are readily distinguished. But when they belong to the same, they are sometimes confounded with one another, at least in common language. A gentleman who farms a part of his own estate, after paying the expense of cultivation, should gain both the rent of the landlord and the profit of the farmer. He is apt to denominate, however, his whole gain profit, and thus confounds rent with profit, at least in common language. The greater part of our North American and West Indian planters are in this situation. They farm, the greater part of them, their own estates, and accordingly we seldom hear of the rent of a plantation, but frequently of its profit. Common farmers seldom employ any overseer to direct the general operation of the farm. They generally, too, work a good deal with their own hands, as plowmen, harrowers, and etc. What remains of the crop after paying the rent, therefore, should not only replace to them their stock employed in cultivation, together with its ordinary profits, but pay them the wages which are due to them, both as laborers and overseers. Whatever remains, however, after paying the rent and keeping up the stock is called profit. But wages evidently make a part of it. The farmer, by saving these wages, must necessarily gain them. Wages, therefore, are in this case confounded with profit. An independent manufacturer who has stock enough both to purchase materials and to maintain himself till he can carry his work to market should gain both the wages of a journeyman who works under a master and the profit which that master makes by the sale of the journeyman's work. His whole gains, however, are commonly called profit, and wages are, in this case too, confounded with profit. Because remember, wages are paid to with the labor you do. And profit, as we know, is derived from stock, right? By the person who manages or employs it. Continuing and finishing off here. A gardener who cultivates his own garden with his own hands unites in his own person the three different characters of landlord, farmer, and laborer. His produce, therefore, should pay him the rent of the first, the profit of the second, and the wages of the third. The whole, however, is commonly considered as the earnings of his labor, Both rent and profit are in this case confounded with wages. You know what's really the caution here about this is that if you confound profit, right, and rent with wages, you actually pay way more taxes on it and lose more money. Remember, it's your money, not the government. As in a civilized country, there are but few commodities of which the exchangeable value arises from labor only, rent and profit contributing largely to that of the far greater part of them. So the annual produce of its labor will always be sufficient to purchase or command a much greater quantity of labor than what was employed in raising, preparing, and bringing that produce to market. If the society were annually to employ all the labor which it can annually purchase, as the quantity of labor would increase greatly every year, so the produce of every succeeding year would be of vastly greater value than that of the foregoing. But there is no country in which the whole annual produce is employed in maintaining the industrious. The idle everywhere consume a great part of it, and according to the different proportions in which it is annually divided between those two different orders of people, its ordinary or average value must either annually increase or diminish or continue in the same from one year to another. But did you hear that? The idle everywhere consume a great part of it. Don't be idle. The idle everywhere consume a great part of it, and according to the different proportions in which it is annually divided between those two different orders of people, its ordinary or average value must either annually increase or diminish or continue the same from one year to another. Bam. That is chapter 6 of The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, called Of the Component Parts of the Price of Commodities. Lots of really gold nuggets in that one. So there are two shorter texts that I'm going to be reading from in just a moment here. You've been listening to Wealth Attraction Research, WAR, W-A-R, Cold Calculation, presented by Hakeem Ali Bokus Alexander on Spreaker, Social Podcasting, and Wisdom, Social Audio Inc. And the title of this, Cold Calculation, actually comes from the next book I'm going to look into called The Little Book of Economics, which is, I don't even know, they don't have chapters. This is a section here, and it's called Man is a Cold Rational Calculator, Economic Man. Man is a Cold Rational Calculator, Economic Man, from the Little Book of Economics. And then after that, I'll proceed to How Money Works, to the section called How Companies Use Debt. All of this stuff is related, and you'll start to notice pieces from every time I read beforehand now Adam Smith and then read these other books. You'll see how much they are derived from that original work. Even so is the Communist Manifesto from Marx and Engels. All right. Hello, welcome to the room, or if you've bounced through, passing through, or are here for us to sit a spell. Hello, Marcianne. What's up, Noble Ron? RB, Aaliyah Random, Jason Kinte, Darryl with the Dashes, Wandering Fool, what's up? Smith James, Ms. Understood, Linda Sunshine West, Zoe, wink wink, Christine Heath, Thon Adut Thon, Michael J, Greg's Take, Terry, Colby, what's up, brother? Doobie, hey, hey. Topics with Mac, what's up, Stella? Dr. Robert James Goodman, Victoria, and Cecilia Grace. Whether you're stopping through or sitting a spell to listen, welcome. Continuing now with Man is a Cold Rational Calculator, Economic Man, from the Little Book of Economics. Wealth Attraction Research continues. In context, the focus is on decision making. Key thinker, oh shiza, Adam Smith. I just read from his book, right? The Wealth of Nations. See, by the way, the reason why I sound surprised sometimes when I'm looking at this is because I'm doing, all of this is cold reading. I'm reading all of this for the first time from these books. I mean, I've read lots of money, finance, and economics books before, but All of these are first-time read-throughs. I'm doing, making a really good use of my time by being efficient, which is the reading that I normally would be doing to build my business and improve, and for self-enrichment anyway, to improve my life in general. I'm simply reading it and sharing with you, as well as my own surprises and opinions and everything about how I'm thinking. So that's where this wealth attraction research is coming from, because you're getting to listen in to my research and maybe a little bit of how I'm actually using it. So yes, so focus is decision making. The key thinker is Adam Smith from 1723 to 1790. Wealth of Nations was published in 1776. Before him, in about 350 BCE, Greek philosopher Aristotle claims that innate self-interest is the primary economic motivator. Holy shit. Man, there must be a reason why I'm being turned on to a lot of this stuff. Just the other day I read from some sections from Aristotle and published that here. And there's a lot of connections. It's starting to make sense why I'm attracted to certain things. They're putting all the pieces together. I'm starting to see where I need to go. So I guess I'm going to have to look at some more Aristotle. I was looking at his book, The Metaphysics, and seeing how far down the rabbit hole goes. So Greek philosopher Aristotle claims that innate self-interest is the primary economic motivator. This is actually what I've learned is echoed by Adam Smith. 1750s, French economist Francois Quesnay claims that self-interest is the motivation behind all economic activity. Yeah, I know I can hear people, now it's not. Yes, it is. Listen, and you'll find why. After, in 1957, U.S. economist Herbert Simon argues that people cannot acquire and digest all available information about every topic, so their rationality is bounded or limited. Once again, U.S. economist Herbert Simon argues that people cannot acquire and digest all available information about every topic, so their rationality is bounded and limited. And nowadays, you're bounding and limiting your own rationality by the crap that you listen to and watch on television and movies and all that stuff like that, because when Herbert Simon said this in 1957, there was no internet for public consumption, that is. 1992, U.S. economist Gary Becker receives the Nobel Prize for his work on rational choice in the fields of discrimination, crime, and human capital. Continuing, most economic models are underpinned by the assumption that humans are essentially rational, self-interested beings. This Homo economicus, or economic man, the idea, which applies equally to men and women, assumes that every individual makes decisions designed to maximize their personal well-being based on a level-headed evaluation of all the facts. They choose the option that offers the greatest utility, satisfaction, with the least effort. This idea was first expounded by Adam Smith in his 1776 work, Wealth of Nations. Again, do you see how much all of the later work, this book being published in 2020 in the United States, I think it was 2012, was in England before, 2012 and 2020, Dorling Kinserly Limited, which is a division of Penguin Random House LLC, right, was first published in 2012 even, and then 2020, right? You see how his work is still being referenced, and all the way through, U.S. economist Gary Becker receives a Nobel Prize for his work on rational choice in the fields of discrimination, crime, and human capital. And that's why looking back at Adam Smith's work, as I've been reading it for this wealth attraction research, is very, very important. Shit hasn't changed. Not that much. It remains so much the same of how the things that are controlling the world and understanding the foundational knowledge of all this gives you a head start. It helps to open up, to crack open the spell books of all of this stuff. So, Smith's central belief was that human economic interaction is governed mainly by self-interest. He argued that it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we can expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. In making rational decisions, suppliers seek to maximize their own profit, right? We just learned about profit, what that is in Adam Smith's book, right? When making rational decisions, suppliers seek to maximize their own profit. The fact that this supplies us with our dinner matters little to them. God, I'm sorry, I'm still baffled. I've been reading through these things kind of arbitrarily, how I actually just started to just go chapter by chapter just because I got the books. I started doing the tandem reading because I have so many books that I want to read. So I just started reading them to be as efficient as possible and also creating content at the same time to be as efficient as possible. And they happen to be lining up so well that it's really amazing how, but that's because this is related work. Let me see where I'm at. Let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So this is the 8th part of this book that I'm reading, whereas in the How Money Works, where am I at on there? This is how companies use debt. So that would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I'm 7. The 7th section in How Money Works. The 8th section in the Little Book of Economics, and chapter 6. Well, now about to go to chapter 7 in my next reading of Wealth of Nations. But it's all lining up. Here we go. Smith's ideas were developed in the 19th century by the British philosopher John Stuart Mill. Mill believed people were beings who desired to possess wealth, by which he meant not just money, but a wealth of all things good. He saw individuals as motivated by the will to achieve the greatest well-being possible, while at the same time expanding the least possible effort to achieve these goals. John Stuart Mill believed people were beings who desired to possess wealth, by which he meant not just money. By the way, the word wealth is related to the word whole. By which he meant not just money, but a wealth of all things good. He saw individuals as motivated by the will to achieve the greatest well-being possible, while at the same time expending the least possible effort to achieve these goals. This is related to, again, that whole white-collar business versus blue-collar that I was talking about earlier, where in Wealth of Nations it was pointed out, right, that there are people who own the capital, right, who, even though they are thus discharged of almost all labor, still expects that his profits should bear a regular proportion to his capital, a regular proportion being a regular percentage of his capital, as with the one who provides a factory with 1,000 pounds worth of labor and materials expects that he'll get 100 pounds at the end of the year, or the one who even through the same management efforts has 7,300 pounds invested into the materials and labor, expects to get 730 pounds, right? So that's the regular profit expected. And that's where it comes from. Individuals as motivated by the will to achieve the greatest well-being possible, while at the same time expending the least possible effort to achieve these goals. Hey, it's not just a theory anymore. It's not just a belief anymore. This is what happens, right? This is what actually is. This is what people are actually doing. This is what CEOs and the people who are heads of company, what everybody who owns a business and runs a business, if they're leading a group of people, what do you think they're doing? They're reaping the profits off of other people's labor by organizing them and directing them, right? In what Adam Smith calls direction and inspection, or inspection and direction. Because what do you want? You want to achieve the greatest well-being possible, while at the same time expending the least possible effort to achieve these goals. Let's go to this flow chart here. Man is a cold, rational calculator, economic man, right? Homo economicus. As individuals, we are self-interested, which flows to the fact that we aim to improve our personal well-being by consuming goods and services and achieving goals. So that we make decisions by collecting information and calculating which actions will help us achieve our aims without being too costly. Man is a cold, rational calculator. We're self-interested. We want to improve our personal well-being by consuming goods and services and achieving goals. We make decisions by collecting information and calculating which actions will help us achieve our aims without being too costly. Man is a cold, rational calculator. Well, the thing is that where the problem is, why people are getting poorer and poorer, is because they're not calculating which actions will help them achieve our aims without being too costly. People aren't budgeting. People aren't managing cash flow. Because it doesn't matter how much money you make, it's how much you keep and invest in the right ways, and that's not what's happening most of the time. So if your income is not exceeding your expenses or outflow, then that's poor cash flow, and that's why you can't keep up with. And that's why for a lot of people there's usually more month at the end of the money instead of more money at the end of the month. It's too much month at the end of the money, right? Cash flow. You can do it. You have to realize what's going on here. If you see the hijack, I was talking to Andrew Raquel about this earlier, is by making people think that it's a bad thing to have self-interest. It's not a bad thing to have self-interest. Right? If you want to think about it in terms of Buddhism, Buddhism doesn't say that the cause of all suffering is selfish desire. It says that the cause of all suffering is exclusively selfish desire, not just selfish desire. It's self-interest. We can say that the cause of suffering is purely self-interest. Didn't say that self-interest is the cause of suffering, right? Just like how the root of all evil is not money, it's the love of money. The love of money would be purely self-interest or purely selfish desire. Money could be equated to self-interest and personal selfish desire, but that doesn't mean that it's purely. Change the idea about what the root of all evil is. It's the love of. It's purely self-interest, purely selfish desire. But selfish desire, self-interest, and money themselves aren't the cause of the problem. The aim to improve personal well-being and achieving goals is not the problem. The problem is how we're collecting information and calculating or not calculating which actions will help achieve the aims without being too costly. In time and in other things. Why do you think I'm being efficient by creating content that thousands and thousands of people are listening to and having to go through my ads and I'm getting paid for while I'm in my sleep? Right? It's efficient. I'm achieving my goals without it being too costly. Right? I'm not getting paid by you guys, but by sitting here and doing this and putting it on another platform, right? There's the rub. But even people that I've who have asked me how to do it, and I've told them they don't do it. So, because they're not calculating which actions will help them achieve their aims without being too costly. Because they're leaning too much on the purely selfish desire, right? Because they're trying to achieve the greatest well-being possible, while at the same time expending the least possible effort to achieve these goals, but they're going too far. The least possible effort is not no effort. Moving on, costs and benefits. Today, the idea of Homo economicus, or economic man, right, is referred to as rational choice theory. This says that people make all kinds of economic and social decisions based on costs and benefits. For example, a criminal thinking of robbing a bank will weigh the benefits, increased wealth and greater respect from other criminals, against the costs, the chances of getting caught, and the effort involved in planning the heist before deciding whether to commit the crime. Economists consider actions to be rational when they are taken as a result of a sober calculation of costs and benefits in relation to reaching a goal. Economics may have little to say about the goal itself, and some goals may appear to be quite irrational to most people. For example, While to most of us it may seem like a dangerous decision to inject the human body with unverified performance-enhancing drugs, for numerous athletes, in the context of the desire to be the best, the decision may be a rational one. Yeah. Some people have questioned whether the idea of Homo economicus is realistic. They argue that it does not allow for the fact that we cannot weigh every relevant factor in a decision. The world is too complex to collect and evaluate all the relevant facts needed to calculate costs and benefits for every action. In practice, we often make quick decisions based on past experience, habit, and rules of thumb. The theory also falters when there are conflicting long and short-term goals. For instance, someone might buy an unhealthy burger to stave off immediate hunger, despite knowing that this is an unhealthy choice. Behavioral economists have begun to explore the way in which humans act differently from Homo economicus when making choices. The idea of economic man may not be entirely accurate for explaining individual behavior, but many economists argue that it remains useful in analyzing the actions of profit-maximizing firms. And again, I've mentioned this before, that you can operate your life like a profit-maximizing firm. And I've even hinted to it again here. And it has nothing to do with you having to be a cold, rational calculator in a bad sense of anything. Don't heap your own ideas of what it means to be cold and calculating onto those words, because it doesn't mean anything evil. Just like the word manipulate only means to handle with skill and care. Just like the word propaganda means to propagate things far and wide, meaning to get them out to as many as possible. People start to heap their negative ideas on top of, and their emotions on top of things that don't mean what you think they do. Like arrogant means to claim for one's own. It doesn't mean something evil inherently by itself. It's what people put on it. Narcissus was simply one who became obsessed with his own image in a clear, a calm lake of water, watching his own reflection. Self-reflection, people, when did that become a fucking problem? Of course. Let's look at family economics. This is the last little section in this book here. It's in a little gray square at the top of this nice black and white book. Family economics. Parents' investments in children, especially through education, are an important source of an economy's capital stock, according to Becker. U.S. economist Gary Becker, 1930 to 2014, was one of the first to apply economics to areas usually thought of as sociology. He argues that decisions relating to family life are made by weighing costs and benefits, not for most of the people who you have those happy accidents, right? For example, he views marriage as a market and has analyzed how economic characteristics influence the matching of partners. Becker also concluded that family members will help each other, not out of love, but out of self-interest in the hope of a financial reward. He believes that investment in a child is motivated by the fact that it often produces a better rate of return than traditional in retirement savings. However, children cannot be legally forced to take care of their parents, so they are brought up with a sense of guilt, obligation, duty, and love, which effectively commits them to helping their parents. Not to me. For this reason, it can be argued that the welfare state damages families by reducing their need for interdependence. Yeah, I don't know. People, y'all can have all of that sense of guilt, obligation, duty, and love if you want to. That should not be a motivator which you find yourself to, that commits you to helping your parents. Your parents brought you into this world. You didn't ask to be here. And whether they did a good job of it or not, blind loyalty. Okay, I got to move on from this. So I got to shut this down and go on to a next. That was from the little book of economics. Man is a cold, rational calculator. Economic man, also known as Homo economicus. All right. And finish off here with how money works. This probably might be the most boring part of it all. Not to me, because this is how I understand. This section is called How Companies Use Debt. How companies use debt. You've been listening to Wealth Attraction Research, WAR, W-A-R, Cold Calculation, presented by Hakeem Ali Bokus Alexander here on Wisdom Social Audio Inc. and Spreaker Social Podcasting. This is the last reading section here from How Money Works, and this is called How Companies Use Debt. When a company wants to expand, it has two main funding options: to borrow money or to issue shares to investors. Borrowing money at a fixed price enables it to budget for costs and calculate potential profits. How it works. By taking on debt, in other words, borrowing money, a firm receives a lump sum of cash, paying back the full amount with interest in regular payments over a fixed term to its creditors. It also retains control over its business strategy, unlike when shares are sold. By issuing shares, a company is selling ownership or equity, stakes in the business. So it's selling ownership stakes in the business, which is known as equity. A firm that raises money via issuing shares may have to allow larger shareholders a say in how the business is run. If the company then makes a profit, it may have to pay dividends to shareholders. Unlike loans, shares do not get paid off. Dividends are paid as long as shares exist. You see how these terms are still being used? That book from Adam Smith back in 1776, which was written in English. He's a Scotsman, right? It wasn't translated from another language. That language is still in use. It's English, but we're still using dividends, shares, profit, right? Firms may use both methods to fund investment, and each approach has different pros and cons. But without the facility to borrow, a company would be unable to take on large projects and make long-term commitments. If a lender is concerned about how a company is being run or its future ability to pay its debt, it may have the option to withdraw the loan or ask the company to reschedule its debt, thereby paying a higher rate of interest to compensate the lender for the increased potential risk. Let's look at a flow of business expansion here. Business expansion. Some companies, for example, those in air travel, car manufacturing, or house building, tend to have higher levels of debt because they have to purchase stock, raw materials, or land well before they sell their products or services. Airplanes wants to expand its, this is two different words, airplanes wants to expand its operations because it foresees greater demand from customers in the future. It plans to construct a new manufacturing plant and needs to raise money to buy the site and build a factory. In order to retain control of its own decisions, Air opts for a bank loan rather than selling shares in its ownership. So Bank 1, Bank 2, and Bank 3. The Bank 1 gives a 3% loan A. Bank 2, loan B, gives 5% interest, and Bank 3 gives loan C at 7% interest. The firm opts for a debt package from 3 different banks. Each charge different rates and terms, and a contract is drawn up. In 5 years, Air is in profit. Air does not need to pay any of its profit to its creditors. The company only has to repay each loan at the end of its respective term. Wow, that's a great way to use debt right there. Here's what you need to know. Yes, cold calculations. That's right. Cold calculations. That's the name of this. Cold calculation. All right, so need to know. Creditors, they're banks, loan companies, and individuals to whom a firm owes money. Dividends. Profits paid to a company's shareholders. Interest payments. That's, by the way, that's how I get paid for my company. They're called dividends. They're not wages, not income. They're dividends. They're profits, because I'm being the sole member, the managing director of my LLC. That's how I pay myself through the business. Money goes into the business, banking account, and then I pay myself dividends. And I'm shielded from anything that might happen. If the company gets sued, they can't go after my personal money. They just go after what's in the bank account of the business. Interest payments. The amount of interest charged on a loan. This is usually fixed and has to be paid on time installments, even if the company is struggling and losing money. I know all about that. Life cycle. The debt phase a company is in. Startups tend to be funded by small bank loans and seed capital, turning to venture capital when they expand, which may involve issuing shares. Getting the balance right. This is about cash flow too, by the way. A company that borrows money as opposed to issuing shares has fixed liabilities and a timetable for repayment. It retains more independence as the creditors don't have a share of the profits or a say in how the company is run. There are also tax advantages. It is cheaper for a firm to bear the cost of debt than equity. Right? It's cheaper for a firm to bear the cost of debt than equity. Remember, equity is selling ownership stakes in the business. Too much debt, and it won't attract any lenders as it is seen as too risky. But using debt, it is able to retain more of its profits. So like if there's too much debt outweighing the assets, the lender might be like, it's too risky. But if you have too little debt, and it may be forced to give away too much control and profits to new shareholders. You see that then those assets go to the shareholders who are holding stock. Don't want that situation either. All right, that was the most boring part, was how companies use debt, and that's it. That's it for this installment of Wealth Attraction Research. So you've been listening to Wealth Attraction Research, presented by Hakeem Ali-Bokus Alexander on Spreaker, Social Podcasting and Wisdom, Social Audio Inc., presented for World Reading Club in association with ExercisingYourMind.com and UniquilibriuM.